It's great to be back here. 30 years ago, I was sitting where you're sitting now, listening to lectures, so it's quite a privilege to come back here and speak to you today. I was asked to talk to you about some of the things I've done as a sociologist, not in the classroom, but also outside the classroom. And I thought I would talk to you mostly today about a project that I just finished, and the book has just come out. It's on the Texas State raid in 2008 on the fundamentalist Latter-day Saints out in El Dorado near San Angelo, Texas. How many of you are aware of that raid or saw any of the press coverage? Yeah. It was a big deal for about a week or two. In fact, it was international news for a week or two, and then it sort of faded into the background. But what I'd like to show you is maybe how some sociological insights and a little bit of research and investigation turns up a completely different story than the one you might have heard or you might have read about in the news coverage. Okay, on April 3rd, 2008, Texas State Police and the Department of Family and Protective Services raided the Yearning for Zion Ranch in El Dorado. It's a community of about 800 members of the fundamentalist Latter-day Saints, a Mormon sect that continues to practice polygamy. In 1890, the LDS Church abandoned polygamy. It was pretty much forced by the federal government to do so in order to achieve statehood. They pretty much decided that Joseph Smith's original revelation about polygamy or celestial marriage was going to be revised, and those who didn't go along with that switch in doctrine or the new pronouncement by the fathers of the church called themselves fundamentalists, and they continued to practice celestial marriage or polygamy. And we estimate today there are probably between 10 and 12,000 fundamentalist Mormons. They have sort of organized into 5 different groups or camps, and the fundamentalist Latter-day Saints is the largest of those groups. State officials claimed they had evidence of, quote, widespread pattern and practice of child sexual abuse and underage marriage, and the state raid was triggered by phone calls to a domestic violence hotline in San Angelo from March 29th to April 3rd from an alleged 16-year-old girl inside the YFZ ranch who said she was beaten and raped by her 49-year-old spiritual husband. The young girl identified herself as Sarah Jessup and claimed to be the 7th wife of Dale Barlow. She said she was forced to marry at 15. She had been beaten, choked, and forced to have sex. She claimed her husband had been beaten so badly. The young girl identified herself as Sarah Barlow and claimed to be the 7th wife, Sarah Jessup, and claimed to be the 7th wife of Dale Barlow. Jessup and Barlow are names that you see a lot of in the fundamentalist Latter-day Saints. As you can imagine, there's intergenerational names that remain constant within these groups over time. Sarah said she was forced to marry at 15. She'd been beaten, choked, and forced to have sex. She claimed her husband had beaten her so badly she was left with broken ribs and had to be taken to the local hospital in San Angelo. She also claimed to have an 8-month-old child and to be pregnant. She requested help from the shelter to escape the ranch, flee the abusive relationship, and 4 days later the Texas State raid was launched to rescue Sarah Jessup and arrest Dale Barlow. The state had a search warrant for the property to find Sarah and an arrest warrant for Dale Barlow. We estimate that between 80 and 100 law enforcement officers descended on the YFZ ranch, and probably law enforcement agents from somewhere between 4 and 5 agencies. It was a joint task force raid. After an extensive 2-day search of the ranch, authorities failed to find Sarah Jessup or the alleged perpetrator, Dale Barlow. Despite finding neither person named in the search warrant or arrest warrant, child protection officials seized 400 and 39 sect children and placed them into state custody. The children were loaded into buses, transported to Fort Concho in San Angelo, in a facility that was converted horse stable. I've been there. There's no air conditioning or heating. They had one bathroom for girls and one bathroom for boys for almost 500 people if you include the mothers who went with their children. It was the largest mass custodial detention of children in American history, and for that reason it's earned its own notation, footnote in history books. State officials later learned that the caller was not, in fact, Sarah Jessup, but a mentally disturbed 33-year-old woman from Colorado Springs. Her name was Rosita Swinton. Ms. Swinton had been arrested previously for making false charges of abuse to police. In February 2008, only weeks before the calls to Texas, Swinton called Colorado Springs police and claimed she was a young girl being held in a basement. She was later arrested on making false charges and released on $20,000 bail from the El Paso, Colorado County Jail. In another call, Swinton claimed to be a 13-year-old student who said she was drugged and sexually abused by her father. In the book, we detail all of these accounts, and some of them are pretty sensational. In fact, Ms. Swinton had been linked to at least 10 incidents of fraudulent claims to child protection and law enforcement agencies across the country since 2006. So why did authorities in Texas fail to verify these calls? They had approximately 40 hours of recorded calls. Nobody bothered to investigate whether these calls might have been corroborated. Calls were accepted pretty much as legitimate without much of a concerted effort to do what we call routine police investigative work. And what makes this question so fascinating is that we learned that Ms. Swinton was also making similar calls to Arizona and to Washington State, pretty much with the same narrative or the same story, making this tantamount to a controlled social science experiment, right? We can do a comparison of what happened, how the officials in Arizona responded, how the officials in Washington responded, and then how the officials in Texas responded. So what happened in Arizona? Officials in Arizona received calls from a woman also alleging to be a 16-year-old girl being sexually abused in the Maine community where the FLDS resides on the border of Arizona and southern Utah, Colorado City. About 6,000 to 8,000 FLDS members reside there. But officials in Arizona were suspicious of the calls because they could not be verified. And after inquiries were made to the community investigators, they concluded that the identity of the caller, Sarah, could not be determined, and officials did not take any action. Let me read to you what the Attorney General of Arizona said in an interview with the Arizona newspaper there. Arizona's Attorney General Terry Goddard said, "I don't have the authority, and local officials don't have the authority to go in and, based on an unverified phone call, sweep up 400 children. If we found that girl who made the allegations, we could take her into custody and perhaps her siblings." The Attorney General further informed the news sources that his staff worked with officials in Colorado City and interviewed families, but that they were unable to find the girl or verify that she exists. "We found nothing to substantiate those allegations." Good police work. In Washington State, Ms. Swinton also made 35 calls to a battered women's shelter in Snohomish, Washington between March 22nd and April 4th. The calls were recorded and amounted to 17.6 hours of conversations with a volunteer. Her story was almost identical to the one told Texas officials. Child protection officials in Washington investigated the calls by conducting a reverse search on the phone number and tracing it to Colorado. When an investigator called the number, a woman answered the phone and told the investigator he had the wrong number. Washington State officials could not verify the calls, the alleged location, or any other evidence, and took no further action. So what did Texas officials do? Yeah, they called out the 101st Airborne, right? They conducted a full-blown paramilitary government raid with armored vehicles, fully automatic weapons, Kevlar helmets, automatic weapons, 9mm handguns, stun grenades, full camouflage gear. Who do you think they expected to find there? Now let me remind you that this is a single allegation of sexual abuse. And they have a full-blown paramilitary government raid. This amounts to swatting a gnat with a hydrogen bomb. Oh yeah, and snipers. I forgot the snipers. So the two problematic issues that we want to address in the book are as follows. One, there's a grossly disproportionate response by the state to the sexual assault allegation. Why did state officials elect to use a paramilitary raid instead of a more routine enforcement action? And number two, the extreme and unprecedented and ultimately illegal action taken by the state to place 439 FLDS children into custody, which again I remind you is the largest mass custodial detention of children in U.S. history. Though the FLDS had no history of violence and authorities had no credible evidence of weapons stockpiles or any threat of an arsenal and offered no resistance, they were treated to a third world style paramilitary foray. The raw show of force by the state leads one to believe that officials expected to find a group more akin to terrorists than to a peaceful religious community. So as a sociologist, I ask, how do we account for this perception, this exaggerated threat that they believed that they were going to find? That's a question that needs to be answered. For those of you who are not sociology majors, you may not be familiar with social constructionist theory, but social constructionist theory tells us that a social problem is not always obvious or self-evident. Many real problems get ignored, while others are given much more attention than is merited. I have parenthetically here voter fraud and Acorn as two good examples recently. They were manufactured problems. In extreme cases, this can account for witch hunts, red scares, pogroms, purges, and of course cult scares. Social problems have to be recognized. They have to be defined as such. They're perceived as threats to cherished values or powerful interests, and authorities have to be pressured to resolve the alleged problem, and this involves the social activity of claims making. Research shows that claims making is more effective if the issues raised reflect pre-existing and widespread social fears or apprehensions. So in a climate of fear, the manufacture of a defined enemy is more readily accomplished. Muslims after 9/11, to be an example. Claims making is more likely to find resonance with a broad social audience, receptive and willing to support the definition of the problem promoted by a crusading group. And history, of course, is replete with all kinds of examples of scapegoating and frenzied claims lodged against new sects. Successful efforts by claimants may take on features of a moral crusade that escalates into what we call a moral panic. What is a moral panic? Moral panics refer to situations in which strong and disproportionate reactions are expressed toward a group that is perceived to be a threat to the social order and becomes the focus of exaggerated attention from media, politicians, interest groups, law enforcement, and others. They do not arise in a social vacuum. So they are products of social activity by claims makers bringing this grievance or this problem forward to the attention of authorities. Now, numerous studies have analyzed overreaction to new or marginalized or fringe religions over time. And we think that this theoretical framework best explains how the attribution of a cult threat fostered by opponents, and these might include apostates, anti-cult movement activists working with sympathetic news reporters, then contributed to a widely held perception that the FLDS posed an imminent danger to their own members and to the broader society. When we combine elements of a moral panic and social constructionist theories, we can increase our understanding not only of the FLDS raid, but other government raids on new or unconventional religions as well. I've been working on a project. Helen mentioned a book that we received a contract for from Oxford Press, working on a kind of a cross-national study of government raids on these kinds of groups over an extended period of time, covering about 5 or 6 decades. And we wanted to look at raids as an aggregate phenomenon rather than individual case studies. All of the research now, we notice, were simply case studies. What happened in Waco with the Branch Davidians? What happened in El Dorado? These are all case studies, and there are plenty of them, but no one has stepped back to look at raids as an aggregate phenomenon. And we began to notice a pattern here. We began to see that these raids followed a certain kind of pattern that could be documented and maybe explained theoretically. And one of the things that is key to our theory is that we have an active counter-movement, and this counter-movement composed of anti-cult movement activists, apostates, sometimes family members of those who were converts and so forth, ally themselves, form coalitions and ally themselves with state actors or sympathetic journalists who frame stories as a cult threat, and they're able to put enough pressure on authorities to finally act. My good friend David Bromley has shown that disputes and conflicts involving groups labeled cults tend to be controlled by what he calls oppositional coalitions. The minority religion in question is painted as a subversive organization and regarded as dangerous, requiring special control agencies with extraordinary authority. The expectation is that the putative violations alleged by opponents will be frequent and serious, and therefore the religious organization is accorded little deference. The organization, the subversive group, rather, has a low coincidence of interests with other organizations, and it certainly has few institutional allies who will stand up for it. As such, the targeted religious organization is, quote, likely to be confronted with unilateral, preemptive, coercive control measures, end quote. And command over the dispute settlement process means that the oppositional coalition controls the definition of alleged violations and can widely disseminate information collected during the investigation and prosecution processes. The result is a dispute broadening process. This dispute broadening process incorporates a range of organizational attributes and practices as external social control agencies define their mission in terms of repressing such groups. Now the model looks something like this. This is a crude version of it at this point. But what I want to point out is that there are cultural opponents made up of anti-cult movement activists, apostates. And when I say apostates, I don't simply mean ex-members. A lot of people leave these groups and don't have lots of incriminating things to say. They don't spend the rest of their life trying to bring some kind of state pressure to debilitate or destroy the group. We call these career apostates. And so when I say apostates, I'm really referring to this subcategory of ex-members, which usually we're talking about 1% perhaps of ex-members. And I've done a little bit of research on ex-members. Then they form alliances with sympathetic news journalists who are willing to frame these stories as cult threats. And if they're able to get the attention of state actors and child protection services and law enforcement, then they can move and put pressure on these religious movements. Now the middle circle you see here, intermediate groups, refers to scholars, civil rights activists, human rights groups and organizations. These are people who, if they're brought into the loop, if they're allowed to be part of the conversation or discussion, then oftentimes the exaggerated perception isn't allowed to develop, because they're going to give information that mitigates some of these outrageous and sensational claims. But when they're ignored or when they're bypassed, when we're most likely to see these raids take place. As I said earlier, my colleague Susan Palmer at Dawson College in Montreal and I have been studying government raids on new religious movements. We spent a summer, a year before last, in Europe, tracking down some of these groups, visiting the communities, interviewing leaders and some of the members, getting valuable information. For the record, you might think that the United States is sort of the center of all this government raid on new religious movements. As it turns out, that's not true. France is the epicenter, believe it or not, of government raids on new or unconventional religious movements. We have documented now 68 raids in 11 different countries, but a third of all those raids have occurred in France. We also see that the number of raids have increased sharply in recent years, and this increase in government raids corresponds to the growth of a well-organized transnational anti-cult movement or counter-cult movement that has shown success in its political alliance with state actors and the strategic framing of new religions as dangerous cults posing a threat to the social order. So you can see on this graph that over time, we went back to the 50s and 1940s, but across time, across 4 or 5 decades from before 1950 up until the mid to late 1980s, on an average, we were only seeing about 4 to 5 government raids on these new religions or unconventional religions per decade, which was pretty much insignificant. And then suddenly we see a dramatic increase in the mid to late 80s through the end of the century there, a dramatic increase, which corresponds this, we think, the better organization of this transnational counter-movement activity and activism. That has fallen off in the first decade of this century somewhat, but it's still considerably higher than it was previously, as you can see. All right, let me give you a little bit of detail about the oppositional coalition and the components of the oppositional coalition, beginning with apostates. The Texas state raid, in our particular case study here, provides support for this model. Swinton, Rosita Swinton, our 33-year-old woman from Colorado Springs, first placed her calls to the outspoken anti-FLDS apostate Flora Jessup. This wasn't made very clear in the news reports. It appeared from the news reports, unless you read them extremely carefully as we did, that the calls went directly to the domestic violence shelter in San Angelo, but that's not the case. They went to this anti-FLDS, very outspoken career apostate Flora Jessup first, and it was Jessup who encouraged Swinton to contact authorities in Texas. Jessup is the founder of Help the Child Brides and what scholars call this career apostate, which I've already described to you. From the inception of the new Yearning for Zion community in 2004, Miss Jessup was engaged in a public crusade against the FLDS in El Dorado. She describes her own claims-making efforts to gain attention of authorities and the media in her autobiography, Church of Lies. It's always nice when people provide you with a lot of the data that you would ordinarily have to go out and dig up, but they provide for you in their biography to support your research. Ms. Jessup recounts contacting local law enforcement in El Dorado, contacting newspaper editors and other journalists, issuing press releases, and traveling to El Dorado to, quote, warn people about what was coming, end quote. She held press conferences alleging sexual abuse, forced marriages, child abuse, tax evasion, child labor violations, welfare fraud, brainwashing, stockpiling weapons, and even possible mass suicide. By the way, that's the only place that we can find any allegation of stockpiling weapons, which apparently the state police in Texas believed, for whatever reason. We trace that to Miss Jessup. Jessup was a continual presence in the media, teaming up with a reporter from ABC's Primetime, appearing regularly on talk shows. Local, regional, and national news stories featured Jessup and incorporated her inflated claims. And in this manner, Jessup's framing of the problem became part of the larger public perception and narrative. These are some various pictures of her doing interviews on news shows and talk shows. You may recognize her, I don't know. She was certainly on the television screen a lot during the raid, right after the raid. In this manner, Jessup's framing of the problem became part of the larger public perception and narrative. But even Jessup's supporters and co-workers concede that her charges were often exaggerated and embellished. For example, the Phoenix New Times once described Jessup as, quote, a publicity-hungry fanatic whose demands to have control over someone else's children are becoming eerily similar to the dictatorial attitude of her sworn nemesis. On a TV news show in Los Angeles, she told an audience that the FLDS was not a religion at all, but a form of terrorism, and she compared it to Al-Qaeda. Arizona Attorney General Terry Goddard has also questioned her methods, complaining that Jessup has gotten nastier and nastier, and said she has, quote, fanned fears without reason. Here's her book, Church of Lies, her coverage in a tabloid newspaper, rather. Arizona State Representative Linda Binder told news reporters in 2004, and this is 4 years before the raid, that the problem with Jessup's approach is that she, quotes, wants to go in there guns a-blazing, getting everybody out, end quote. A very interesting quote. In her highly visible role as a career apostate and passionate opponent of the FLDS, Jessup was a conspicuous choice for the emotionally disturbed Swinton. Jessup was predisposed to believing the caller's claims and pleas for help. And more important, Jessup was well connected to the network of child protection agencies and state enforcement personnel in Arizona, Utah, and Texas. She had extensive involvement with county and state officials in those 3 states, which are well documented in her book. And apparently she had achieved a degree of credibility among child protection workers, so that when she did contact state authorities in Texas, she was taken seriously. I don't have time to discuss some of the other apostates, but Flora Jessup is clearly the key figure here, and so I spent all my time on her. The second component of the oppositional coalition would be anti-cult movement activists. Independent of connections to law enforcement and child protection officials, Flora Jessup was linked to ACM organizations and actors. This can be seen on her website. She has a section on resources and links listing organizations that she's referring, and these include the International Cultic Studies Association, Steve Hassan's Freedom of Mind Center, Meadowhaven, a cult rehabilitation center billed as a resource for cult survivors to transition into society, and Rick Ross's Institute for the Study of Destructive Cults, Controversial Groups, and Movements. I'm familiar with all these organizations and individuals over the years. Rick Ross in particular was a key figure in the claims-making efforts made against the FLDS in the months and years leading up to the raid. Mr. Ross has no credentials. He has no academic credentials, no education that would qualify him to be a, quote, cult expert. He's a convicted felon. He was a deprogrammer for a number of years. And if you don't know what a deprogrammer is, it's someone who has bought into the ideology that people are programmed or brainwashed into these religious groups, so they have to be deprogrammed. So this involved abduction, kidnapping, forcibly oftentimes, and transporting individuals across state lines, putting them in some kind of coercive situation against their will, kind of a false imprisonment. He was eventually sued by one of his victims and had to give up that career. That's Mr. Ross right there. Ross's website features an archive of news articles highlighting alleged abuses by cults, but the FLDS is perhaps the most prominently featured, with a list of over 800 news articles on his website. In the years leading up to the raid, Jessup and Ross are quoted in tandem in the San Angelo newspaper, making sensational claims against the FLDS. Ross invokes standard ACM framing of the group, accuses them of brainwashing, compares Warren Jeffs to Jim Jones and the FLDS to Jonestown, a group where over 900 people committed mass suicide in Guyana in 1978. Ross promotes himself as a cult expert and the reporter for the newspaper serves up this claim, but uncritically doesn't attempt to validate his credentials. He's interviewed multiple times, and his claims of an exaggerated threat are cycled through the press reports as expert opinion. By the way, I'm probably going to get this question, so let me make this disclaimer now. I'm not in any way defending Warren Jeffs or underage marriage in this case. In fact, Mr. Jeffs was already in prison. He was already in jail, sitting in a jail cell in Utah when this raid took place. So the raid wasn't about Warren Jeffs. The raid was triggered by these phone calls by Ms. Swinton that turned out to be fraudulent. And in the case of underage marriage, my position on that is that if a group commits crimes, then the investigations should go forward on a case-by-case basis. My problem, as you might have already intuitively perceived, is that this was a disproportionate response to an allegation. All right, another component of the oppositional coalition is the media. Media sources played a critical role in promoting the claims of cultural opponents. The San Angelo Standard-Times gave Flora Jessup considerable coverage and voice in her campaign against the FLDS as early as 2005. Jessup explicitly acknowledges this in her book, and indeed, these stories catapulted the cult threat narrative into the public consciousness, stirring apprehensions and fears among local officials and eventually state authorities. Usually reliable media sources such as CNN, the Boston Globe, ABC, and so forth gave Jessup major media exposure as she repeated these exaggerated claims on a national stage. And then the other component, the final component of this coalition is state actors. And during and after the FLDS raid, child protection officials evidenced an anti-cult framing of the FLDS, inflating child abuse claims, inflaming prejudice by casting the group as a cult, which is not a neutral descriptive term, but really a derogatory term. Scholars in this field of study have pretty much abandoned the term cult. It used to have more of a scholarly meaning and operational definition, but it's been appropriated in the public mind by opponents, and now the term has a completely different meaning in the popular mindset than the classical understanding of the concept of cult. While there was some cases of underage marriage, the massive sweep of the children proved to be an egregious overreach. The Texas Court of Appeals found that the district court abused its discretion by allowing the mass custodial detention of the children without evidence and then ordered them returned to their parents. They did say that the department could provide evidence for each child in separate hearings if they wanted to have 439 hearings, but they didn't have evidence for all those cases, and knew that that was not something that they were going to be able to do. We went out and interviewed social workers, child protection workers who were not part of the Department of Family and Protective Services, were brought into San Angelo as independent workers to aid the processing of these children. And we got very different stories from what we got officially from the state on this. Linda Werlin, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Hill County Community MHMR Center in Kerrville, told us that much of what she was told by the Department of Family and Protective Services turned out to be wrong. She stated in a sworn affidavit that the state had, quote, misrepresented evidence of child abuse, and another of Ms. Werlin's staff said that the only signs of child abuse I saw took place in the pavilion where these children were being held. And she was clearly indicating to us that the only child abuse she saw was what the state was doing to the children and not what the religious community had done. So I interviewed Ms. Werlin, and she repeated these allegations. When I saw these quotes in newspaper accounts, I called her up and we had a long discussion and asked her to tell me what she did see. And if, I would like to read a little bit of what she said, because I quoted her extensively in the book. She says, in our work, we know the difference between nurturing mothers and non-nurturing mothers. We get children in our clinic who have been abused, and we know what that child looks like. Now, I know that's not scientific, I know it's anecdotal, but we did not see children who were being abused. So Ms. Werlin and her staff determined that the claims were baseless and then began asking for sources of evidence of this abuse. And they were told that the investigation was being guided or informed by what she called cult experts. And again, I want to quote her. She says, I was interested in asking people about their sources. Where are you getting this information? Like they had information that the FLDS had tunnels underneath their houses. Now, I know El Dorado is one of the towns in the 19 counties we serve, and I said, have you ever been there? To this one lady. And she said, no, why? I said, good luck on finding a tunnel. It's solid rock out there. I know they searched for tunnels, but there were none. I was also told it was an investigation, and the experts, and I never knew who they were, they said that they understood and studied a lot about this group. And it turned out actually they were not experts, but they were experts on cults generally, and not the FLDS group. When I would ask specific questions, they would just quote the experts and then say, but you don't understand. So returning to the two problematic questions we posed at the beginning, number one, the disproportionate response by the state to the sexual abuse allegation, the paramilitary raid, and number two, the massive custodial detention of FLDS children. We do see support for our model to explain the raid. The dispute or conflict involving a disfavored religious group labeled a cult was defined and controlled by the oppositional coalition here, resulting in a dispute broadening process. And we see these narratives or motifs of cult rescue and child saving. The mobilization of cultural opponents allied with media and state actors propelled the inflated threat and use of overwhelming force against the targeted group. Once the targeted group is successfully cast as a cult, it becomes the embodiment of quintessential evil and is considered an imminent threat to the larger social order. Thus, a counter-subversion ideology can be constructed more readily to legitimate expanded social control efforts. New or unconventional religions face great difficulty in defending themselves against subversionist allegations because they typically are in high-tension relationship with the host society. They're easy marks for stereotyping and scapegoating and have few institutional allies. So when confronted with a broad coalition of opponents, they're vulnerable to false charges and claims and hence to more intense coercive control measures by the state. To repeat something I said just a few minutes ago, I'm not suggesting that alleged crimes by marginalized religions should not be investigated, but I am suggesting that the investigation of abuse claims at the YFZ Ranch could have been conducted just as effectively and at much less of an emotional cost to the religious community, and particularly the children in that religious community, not to mention the inordinate financial cost to the state. There was a price tag on this for 14 million taxpayers. Through routine investigative procedures. What happened in Arizona? What happened in Washington? Could have saved us a lot of grief, a lot of expense, a lot of trouble. The FLDS raid offers yet another example that new or unconventional religious groups are unjustly singled out and treated differently from established religious organizations when criminal complaints are lodged. Now let me drive this point home by making 2 points of comparison here. In 2004, a report by the John Jay College of Criminal Justice commissioned by the Conference of Catholic Bishops found that by 2002, over 10,000 complaints had been filed against pedophile priests for sexual abuse of young boys. The report states that the abuse was systemic, pervasive, and that when abusive priests were discovered, it was often denied and concealed by the church, and that these same priests were transferred to other parishes to avoid detection. Yet thousands of complaints of sexual abuse in the Catholic Church did not lead to government raids on parishes to confiscate evidence, execute search warrants, or conduct show-of-force operations. And Catholic parishes were not the target of SWAT teams and armored tanks and automatic weapons, snipers, and paramilitary police in combat gear. You might ask yourself why. A second point of reference here is the rationale offered by the Department of Family and Protective Services for its role in the raid and the subsequent custodial detention of the children. Officials for the DFPS told the public during the raid that these drastic and urgent actions were necessary to protect the children. But this explanation proved to be pretty feeble in light of its own record in routine supervisory activities of child protection. About a year after the raid, the Houston Chronicle reported that nearly half of all Texas children killed by abuse belonged to families previously investigated by the Child Protective Services, a statistic that has shown no improvement since 2004, despite efforts to save more children. Between 2004 and 2009, at least 1,227 children died of abuse in Texas, and 516 of those children came from families with CPS histories. The underfunded, perpetually underfunded public services, department spent precious dollars to help launch a raid and execute a massive sweep of FDLS children, while at the same time failing in its duties of routine supervision of child protection. Might the expenditure of scarce taxpayer dollars have been spent in less dramatic, everyday supervision of children in the care of the state? These 2 points of reference suggest an important sociological insight, that relationships of power often trump the law. Minority religions face differential treatment despite established legal and constitutional guarantees designed to protect religious expression and ensure equality under the law. The targeting of minority religions for specifically violent and intimidating force reveals a practice of state intolerance and discrimination that is unacceptable in a democratic society guided by the rule of law. So it is the uneven and unequal application of the law in the cases of these religions that we want to point out is discriminatory. In the FLDS case, we find that child welfare officials, state police, and other moral gatekeepers already concerned about the threat posed by the new community were more inclined to believe sensational claims about the sect. State authorities came to accept uncritically allegations targeting the FLDS that played to the worst cult stereotypes, and this in turn contributed to the perception of an exaggerated threat, resulting in an ill-advised government siege of another minority religious community. So what we have here is another case to add to our archive of cases in government raids on minority religions, in which we have allegations and claims made that are embellished, inflated. Right? These claims are made persistently by groups of people, some who are claiming that they're experts. If you're an ex-member of a group, we almost infer that that person must be an expert because they're an ex-member, not making the distinction between career apostates who may make up probably less than 1% of all people who leave these groups, and the 99% who might leave and not take up the crusade, the moral crusade against the group, and being aware of that distinction. So that wraps up my my presentation to you.